I never thought speaking Spanish would change my life until that Tuesday morning when I watched an elderly Mexican woman cry in the emergency room lobby of Chicago General Hospital. She was clutching a crumpled piece of paper with trembling hands, speaking rapidly to the receptionist who just stared at her with that blank, annoyed expression I'd seen too many times. The woman kept repeating, mi nieto, while pointing at the paper, but the receptionist just shrugged and said louder, as if volume would somehow translate her words. I was rushing past with a cart full of supplies when I heard her desperate voice crack with frustration. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't just walk by and pretend I didn't understand every word she was saying. I approached the reception desk where the elderly woman stood, her weathered hands shaking as she held what looked like a hospital bracelet. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a faded floral dress that reminded me of my own grandmother. The smell of her perfume, something sweet and powdery, mixed with the antiseptic hospital air. She looked up at me, with eyes full of hope when I spoke to her in Spanish. ¿En qué puedo ayudarla, señora? The relief that washed over her face was immediate and heartbreaking. Gracias a Dios, she whispered, pressing the hospital bracelet into my palm. Mi nieto está aquí. Carlos Mendoza. Lo trajeron anoche después de un accident. Her voice broke as she explained how she'd taken 3 buses from Little Village to get here, how no one could tell her where her grandson was or if he was okay. The receptionist rolled her eyes and turned back to her computer, muttering something under her breath about these people not learning English. I felt my jaw clench at the comment, but I focused on Mrs. Mendoza. She'd introduced herself as Elena. I looked at the bracelet in my hand. Carlos Mendoza, room 314, admitted for observation after a motorcycle accident. Está en el tercer piso, señora Elena. Su nieto está bien. Solo lo tienen en observation. I told her, watching her shoulders sag with relief. She grabbed my hands and squeezed them, tears streaming down her cheeks as she thanked me over and over. But finding the room number was just the beginning. When I offered to take her upstairs, Mrs. Elena confessed she was terrified of elevators and didn't know how to navigate the hospital's maze-like corridors. She'd already been lost for 2 hours, going from floor to floor, asking anyone who would listen. Most people had simply pointed in random directions or ignored her completely. One security guard had even suggested she try speaking American if she wanted help. As we climbed the stairs slowly, she had arthritis in her knees. Mrs. Elena told me about Carlos. He was 22, working 2 jobs to pay for community college, and he was her whole world since her daughter died in a factory accident 3 years ago. "Y estudió lo que me queda," she said softly. "He's all I have left." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I thought about my own family, how my parents had struggled with English when we first moved here from Puerto Rico, how many times they'd been dismissed or ignored because of their accent. The 3rd floor was busier than usual, nurses and doctors rushing between rooms, monitors beeping constantly. Mrs. Elena's grip on my arm tightened as we walked down the hallway toward room 314. She was nervous about seeing Carlos injured, worried about the medical bills, scared about how they'd get home since she'd spent her last $20 on bus fare. I assured her that social services could help with transportation, that Carlos was going to be fine based on what I'd read in his chart. When we reached room 314, I knocked gently before opening the door. Carlos was awake, his left leg elevated and bandaged, but alert and clearly relieved to see his grandmother. The reunion was beautiful and heartbreaking. They both started crying, speaking rapidly in Spanish, him apologizing for worrying her scolding him for being reckless on that motorcycle. I stepped back to give them privacy, feeling good about the small act of kindness in what was usually a chaotic, impersonal environment. That's when I noticed him. A tall man in an expensive suit standing in the hallway, partially hidden behind the doorframe of the room across from Carlos's. He was watching everything, taking notes on his phone, his expression unreadable. Our eyes met for just a moment before he disappeared around the corner. Something about the way he'd been observing made my stomach twist with unease, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had other patients to check on, medications to distribute, and Mrs. Elena was asking me to help her understand Carlos's discharge papers. The rest of my shift felt different after helping Mrs. Elena. I couldn't shake the image of that man in the suit watching us, but I tried to focus on my regular duties. Around noon, I was restocking supplies in the supply closet when I overheard two nurses talking by the medication cart. "Did you see that girl speaking Spanish to that old lady this morning?" one of them said. "I swear these people need to learn English if they want to live here." The other nurse laughed. At least someone was willing to deal with her. I would have called security to escort her out. My hands froze on the box of gauze I was carrying. These were colleagues I'd worked with for 2 years, people I'd considered friends. The casual cruelty in their voices made my chest tighten with anger and disappointment. I wanted to confront them, to ask how they could work in healthcare with such callous attitudes toward vulnerable patients. Instead, I quietly closed the supply closet door and walked away, their laughter still echoing in the hallway. The afternoon brought more uncomfortable encounters. Dr. Patterson, the attending physician in the ER, cornered me near the nurse's station. "I heard you were playing translator this morning," he said with a condescending smile. "You know we have official interpreter services for a reason. We can't have staff members randomly communicating with patients in foreign languages. It's a liability issue." His tone made it clear this wasn't a friendly suggestion but a warning. I nodded politely, but inside I was seething. Foreign languages? Spanish was spoken by millions of Americans, including many of our patients. Later, while updating patient charts, I noticed several comments about Mrs. Elena in the system. Patient's family member required excessive assistance due to language barrier. Grandmother caused disruption in lobby, delayed other patients. Recommend directing non-English speakers to interpreter services immediately upon arrival. The clinical language couldn't hide the underlying message. She was seen as a problem, not a person. These notes would follow her family permanently in their medical records. The breaking point came around 3 o'clock. I was helping an elderly Anglo patient, Mr. Williams, who'd been waiting for discharge papers for hours. He was frustrated and started complaining loudly about the hospital's inefficiency. "This place is going downhill," he said. "Too many of those people coming here, taking resources away from real Americans. I saw one of them causing a scene this morning, couldn't even speak proper English." He looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to agree with his racist rant. My Puerto Rican heritage wasn't immediately obvious to most people. My lighter skin and anglicized last name from my ex-husband allowed me to pass in predominantly white spaces. But hearing Mr. Williams's words made my blood boil. "Sir," I said carefully, "every patient deserves compassionate care regardless of their language or background. Mrs. Mendoza wasn't causing a scene. She was a worried grandmother looking for her injured grandson." His face reddened. "Well, if you ask me, they should learn English or go back where they came from." I excused myself before I said something that would cost me my job. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection, wondering how many times I'd stayed silent when I should have spoken up. How many Mrs. Alinas had I walked past before today? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm down. When I returned to the floor, the charge nurse, Linda, was waiting for me with a strange expression. "Someone wants to see you," Linda said, handing me a note written on hospital letterhead. "Conference room B, 4th floor. Now." The note was signed by someone named Richard Morrison, with a title I'd never seen before, Chief Executive Officer. My stomach dropped. CEOs didn't meet with nursing technicians unless something was very wrong. Had someone complained about me helping Mrs. Elena? Was I about to be fired for violating some policy I didn't know existed? The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt endless. I'd never been to the administrative wing before. It was a different world from the clinical floors below. The hallways were carpeted, the lighting softer, the walls decorated with expensive artwork instead of health education posters. Everything smelled like leather and coffee instead of disinfectant and antiseptic. My sneakers squeaked against the polished floors as I searched for conference room B. When I found the room, I knocked hesitantly. "Come in," said a deep voice from inside. The man who opened the door was the same person I'd seen watching us in the hallway that morning. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. His suit looked like it cost more than I made in a month. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from a massive mahogany table. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, a view I'd never seen from inside the hospital. "I'm Richard Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "I believe you helped a patient's family member this morning." Mrs. Elena Mendoza. His handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. Yes, sir. She was looking for her grandson. I helped her find his room. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And you spoke to her in Spanish? It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. She didn't speak English, and she was very upset about— He held up his hand to stop me. I know exactly what happened, he said, pulling out his phone. I watched the entire interaction. My heart started racing. Had I violated some policy? Was this about liability? About overstepping my boundaries as a nursing technician? The silence stretched between us as he scrolled through something on his phone, his expression giving nothing away about whether I was in trouble or not. Mr. Morrison set his phone down and leaned back in his leather chair, studying my face. The silence was unbearable. Finally, he spoke, and what he said shocked me completely. ¿Habla usted español con fluidez? His Spanish was perfect, with no trace of an accent. I blinked in surprise. Sí, señor. Y es mi primer idioma. He nodded approvingly. Mine too, actually. My mother was from Guadalajara. I grew up bilingual, though most people here don't know that. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He had understood every word of Mrs. Elena's desperation, every cruel comment from the staff, everything. You're probably wondering why I called you here, he continued, switching back to English. I've been CEO of this hospital for 8 years, and I make it my business to know what's happening on every floor. What I witnessed this morning was both inspiring and deeply troubling. He stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Inspiring because of your compassion and professionalism. Troubling because it highlighted a systemic problem we've been struggling with for years. He turned back to face me, his expression serious. Do you know that 37% of our patient population speaks Spanish as their primary language? Yet we have exactly 2 certified interpreters on staff, and they're only available during business hours Monday through Friday. After hours and on weekends, families like the Mendozas are left to navigate our system alone. The statistics he quoted made my stomach churn. How many people had suffered in silence because of this gap in services? What you did this morning, he continued, shouldn't have been remarkable. It should have been standard protocol. But instead, you were the only person in that entire lobby who treated Mrs. Mendoza with basic human dignity. He pulled out a manila folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table between us. I've been reviewing your personnel file. 2 years as a nursing technician, excellent performance reviews, studying for your RN degree at night. No disciplinary actions, multiple commendations from patients and families. I felt dizzy trying to process this conversation. Was this praise, or was he building a case against me? Sir, if I violated any policies he waved his hand dismissively. You violated no policies. If anything, you exemplify the values this hospital claims to uphold. Compassion, excellence, integrity. The question is, would you be interested in helping us live up to those values in a more official capacity? The folder he placed on the table contained documents I couldn't quite read from my angle, but I caught glimpses of job descriptions and salary figures that made my eyes widen. I'm creating a new position, he explained. Director of Patient Advocacy and Cultural Liaison. The person in this role would oversee interpreter services, cultural competency training for staff, and serve as a bridge between our Hispanic patient population and the administration. The salary would be $68,000 annually, plus benefits and tuition reimbursement for your nursing degree. My current salary was $32,000. This would more than double my income and allow me to quit my weekend job at the retail store. I could focus on my studies, help my parents with their medical bills, maybe even save money for the first time in my adult life. But something about this felt too good to be true. Why me? I asked. I'm not even a registered nurse yet. Surely there are more qualified candidates. Mr. Morrison sat back down, his fingers steepled. Qualifications can be taught. Genuine compassion cannot. What you demonstrated this morning, the instinct to help someone in need regardless of potential consequences, that's what we need leading this initiative. Plus, your bilingual abilities and cultural understanding are invaluable assets. He slid the folder across the table toward me. Take a look at the job description. The position would start next Monday. As I flipped through the documents, my excitement grew. The role included developing programs for Hispanic families, training staff on cultural sensitivity, advocating for patients who face language barriers. It was everything I dreamed of doing but never thought possible with my limited credentials. The salary breakdown showed not just the base pay but also performance bonuses, health insurance that would cover my parents, and a professional development budget for conferences and continuing education. "There's one more thing," Mr. Morrison said, his tone becoming more serious. "This position comes with significant visibility. You'll be representing the hospital at community events, healthcare conferences, possibly even media interviews. Chicago General is making a commitment to cultural competency, and you be the face of that commitment. Are you comfortable with that level of responsibility and public attention?" I thought about Mrs. Elena's grateful tears, about the casual racism I'd witnessed from my colleagues, about all the families who might benefit from having an advocate within the system. "Yes, sir. I'm ready for that responsibility." He smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room, and this time it seemed genuine. "Excellent. HR will need you to complete some paperwork, background checks, that sort of thing. But assuming everything processes smoothly, you'll start Monday morning." "Congratulations, Director." The title felt surreal. Director. Me, a girl from Humboldt Park whose parents cleaned office buildings to pay for her education. As I stood to leave, Mr. Morrison shook my hand again. "One last thing. What you experienced today, the comments from staff, the attitudes toward Hispanic patients, I want you to document everything. Names, dates, specific incidents. This cultural change we're implementing needs to be comprehensive, and that includes addressing problematic behaviors from existing employees." Walking back to the elevator, I felt like I was floating. The folder in my hands contained my future, a career that would let me help people like Mrs. Elena while building something meaningful for myself. But as the elevator descended toward the clinical floors, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a question I couldn't quite shake. Why had this opportunity appeared so quickly after this morning's incident? And why did Mr. Morrison seem so prepared with job descriptions and salary figures for a position that was supposedly just being created? Por favor, comente que opinas sobre esta situación. ¿Crees que ella debería confiar completamente en esta oportunidad? No olvides escribir para saber qué pasa después. My first week as Director of Patient Advocacy and Cultural Liaison felt like a dream. I had my own office on the 4th floor, small but with a window, and business cards with my name embossed in gold lettering. The HR department had fast-tracked all my paperwork, and suddenly I found myself attending executive meetings, reviewing budget allocations, and designing cultural competency training programs. The salary increase allowed me to move out of my cramped studio apartment into a one-bedroom place in Lincoln Park, closer to the hospital and in a neighborhood I'd only driven through before. But the honeymoon period ended abruptly on Friday afternoon when I overheard a conversation in the break room. 2 nurses from the ER were discussing my promotion with barely concealed resentment. "Can you believe they gave that girl Morrison's pet project?" said Janet, the same nurse who'd made the cruel comments about Mrs. Elena. "She's been here 2 years, and suddenly she's a director? Meanwhile, I've been waiting 3 years for a charge nurse position." "It's all about politics now," replied her companion, stirring sugar into her coffee with sharp, angry movements. "Speak a little Spanish, cry some tears about diversity, and boom, instant promotion. Never mind experience or education. They probably needed their token Hispanic in management." The word token hit me like a slap. I stood frozen outside the break room door, my lunch tray trembling in my hands. The whispers and sideways glances followed me everywhere after that. In meetings, I noticed how conversations would pause when I entered, how colleagues would exchange meaningful looks when I spoke. My ideas for cultural competency training were met with polite nods and immediate topic changes. The 2 certified interpreters I was supposed to supervise treated me with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism about my qualifications and sudden authority over their department. The real wake-up call came the following Tuesday during my first community outreach event. Mr. Morrison had arranged for me to speak at a Hispanic Chamber of Commerce breakfast about Chicago General's commitment to cultural inclusivity. I prepared extensively, researching best practices from other hospitals, gathering statistics about health disparities in Latino communities, and crafting what I thought was an inspiring presentation about breaking down language barriers in healthcare. The event was held at a hotel ballroom in Pilsen, decorated with papal picado and mariachi music playing softly in the background. Local business owners, community leaders, and healthcare advocates filled round tables covered in white linens. I felt confident in my navy blue suit, my first professional wardrobe purchase with my new salary, and the presentation slides looked polished on my laptop screen. But as I began speaking, I noticed something odd. Several attendees were taking notes, but not the usual kind. They were writing down everything I said with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine community presentation. One man in the back was recording everything on his phone, despite the no recording policy mentioned in the program. Another woman kept checking her watch and whispering to her table mate as if they were waiting for something specific to happen. After my presentation, the questions were surprisingly pointed. "How long have you worked in hospital administration?" asked a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Carmen Rodriguez from the University of Illinois. When I admitted I'd been in my current role for only 2 weeks, murmurs rippled through the audience. "And what specific training do you have in healthcare policy and cultural competency?" The question felt like a trap, and my answer, that I was learning on the job and relying on my lived experience, sounded weak even to my own ears. But the most uncomfortable moment came during the networking session afterward. A distinguished older man approached me with a knowing smile. "Congratulations on your rapid promotion," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Miguel Santos from the Chicago Tribune. I'm working on a story about diversity initiatives at local hospitals. Interesting timing, your appointment coming right after that discrimination complaint was filed against Chicago General." My blood turned to ice. What discrimination complaint? He looked genuinely surprised by my reaction. "You don't know?" 3 families filed complaints with the state health department last month, claiming Chicago General systematically discriminates against Hispanic patients. Poor interpreter services, cultural insensitivity from staff, substandard care. The investigation started 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, exactly when Mr. Morrison offered me the position. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. My inspiring moment with Mrs. Elena hadn't been a random act of kindness that caught the CEO's attention. It had been captured on security cameras, just as the hospital needed evidence of their commitment to Hispanic patients. My promotion wasn't recognition of my potential, it was damage control, a strategic move to counter accusations of discrimination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction with Mr. Morrison, looking for signs I'd missed. His preparedness with the job description, the rush timeline, the emphasis on public visibility and media interviews. He hadn't created this position for me. He created it because the hospital desperately needed a Hispanic face in leadership to deflect the discrimination investigation. I felt sick thinking about how excited I'd been, how grateful I'd felt for this opportunity. Had Mrs. Elena been a plant, orchestrated to create the perfect scenario? No. Her tears had been real, her desperation genuine. But my response had been conveniently captured and perfectly timed for the hospital's needs. I'd been played, manipulated into becoming their token diversity hire just when they needed one most. The worst part was realizing that everyone else seemed to know. The suspicious looks from colleagues, the pointed questions at the chamber breakfast, the journalist who expected me to be aware of the investigation. I was apparently the only person naive enough to believe this promotion was based on merit rather than political necessity. Wednesday morning brought a meeting invitation that confirmed my worst fears. Emergency Executive Committee meeting, discrimination investigation response strategy. The subject line made my stomach churn. I was about to discover exactly how they planned to use me as their shield against the accusations that could destroy Chicago General's reputation and federal funding. Lo mejor de esta historia aún no ha pasado. Se escribe para descubrir toda la verdad detrás de esta promotion. The emergency executive meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. in the hospital's boardroom, a space I'd never seen before. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago River, and the mahogany conference table could seat 20 people. When I arrived, 7 executives were already seated, including Mr. Morrison, the chief medical officer, the chief financial officer, and the head of legal affairs. They all looked up when I entered, their expressions grave and calculating. Mr. Morrison gestured to an empty chair. Thank you for joining us. We need to discuss the State Health Department investigation and your role in our response strategy. A woman I didn't recognize opened a laptop and began reading from what appeared to be legal documents. The complaints allege systematic discrimination against Hispanic patients, inadequate interpreter services, and hostile treatment from medical staff. The state investigators arrive next Monday for a full audit of our policies and procedures. The chief financial officer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. If these allegations are substantiated, we're looking at potential federal funding cuts, Medicare reimbursement penalties, and civil lawsuits that could bankrupt this hospital. We need to demonstrate immediate and substantial changes to our cultural competency protocols. His eyes fixed on me. That's where your new position becomes crucial to our defense strategy. The head of legal affairs slid a thick folder across the table to me. We need you to prepare a comprehensive report documenting all cultural sensitivity improvements implemented since your appointment. Media interviews, community outreach events, staff training programs, policy changes. Everything that shows Chicago General's proactive commitment to Hispanic patient care. The implication was clear. I wasn't being asked to document reality, but to create a narrative that would satisfy investigators. There's more, Mr. Morrison added, his tone becoming more serious. The families who filed complaints have agreed to participate in depositions next week. We need you to reach out to them, explain the new initiatives you're implementing, perhaps convince them that their concerns are being addressed. A personal touch from someone who shares their cultural background could be very persuasive. My stomach twisted as I realized they wanted me to manipulate the victims of discrimination into dropping their complaints. The chief medical officer, Dr. Patricia Williams, spoke up for the first time. We've also arranged for you to testify before the state investigators about the hospital's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Your personal story, rising from nursing technician to director based on merit and cultural competency, will be compelling evidence of our progressive policies. Merit. The word felt like poison in my mouth now that I understood the real reason for my promotion. Questions? Mr. Morrison asked, scanning the faces around the table. I had a million questions, but none I could ask without revealing that I discovered their manipulation. Instead, I nodded and asked about timelines and procedures, playing the part of the grateful employee eager to help her employer. Inside, I was screaming. After the meeting, I returned to my office and stared at the folder they'd given me. It contained draft press releases describing my promotion as part of a long-planned diversity initiative, quotes attributed to me that I'd never said, and talking points for media interviews I hadn't agreed to give. They'd already written my story, crafted my narrative, decided how I would present myself to investigators and reporters. The final document in the folder made my blood run cold, a confidentiality agreement requiring me to sign a pledge not to discuss internal hospital policies, personnel decisions, or ongoing legal matters with anyone outside the organization. The penalty for violating this agreement was immediate termination and legal action to recover damages, including repayment of salary and benefits received in my current position. That afternoon, I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I researched the discrimination complaints online. The Chicago Tribune had published detailed articles about the 3 families who'd filed complaints. Maria Santos, whose diabetic son had waited 6 hours in the ER because no one could translate his symptoms. Eduardo Morales, whose elderly mother died after receiving incorrect medication due to miscommunication about her allergies. And Elena Mendoza, whose grandson Carlos had been denied pain medication because staff assumed he was drug-seeking based on his appearance and accent. Elena Mendoza, the same Mrs. Elena I'd helped find Carlos's room. The same woman whose gratitude had launched my career and whose story was now being used to defend against her own discrimination complaint. The irony was nauseating. My act of kindness toward her had become evidence of the hospital's cultural sensitivity, while she was simultaneously suing them for the discrimination she'd experienced before and after that encounter. I called the number listed in the Tribune article and reached Mrs. Elena directly. When I identified myself as the young woman who'd helped her that day in the hospital, she became emotional. "I'm Mija Gracias. You were the only person who treated us like human beings." Her voice broke as she described everything that had happened before I arrived, the security guard who'd threatened to call immigration, The nurses who'd mocked her accent, the doctor who'd refused to explain Carlos's condition because she probably wouldn't understand anyway. That's why we filed the complaint, she continued. Not just for us, but for all the families who suffer in silence because they don't speak perfect English. My grandson could have died because of their prejudice. One kind person shouldn't be enough to make the difference between life and death. Her words hit me like a physical blow. She was right. My moment of compassion had been an exception, not the rule, and that exception was now being weaponized to silence her legitimate grievances. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't be their token, their shield, their manufactured evidence of progress while real families continue to suffer. But I also couldn't simply quit and walk away. Too many people depended on the changes this position could create if used honestly. I needed to find a third option, a way to honor Mrs. Elena's trust while exposing the hospital's manipulation. I started by making copies of everything. The confidentiality agreement, the talking points, the fabricated quotes, the strategy documents from the executive meeting. Then I began documenting every instance of discrimination I witnessed, every racist comment from staff, every family that struggled with language barriers. If Chicago General wanted to use me as evidence of their cultural competency, I would make sure that evidence reflected the whole truth, not just the convenient parts. The next morning, I called Miguel Santos from the Chicago Tribune. I'm ready to tell you about that diversity initiative, I said. But I think you're going to be surprised by what really happened. The meeting with Miguel Santos took place at a small cafe in Pilsen, far from the hospital where we might be overheard. I brought copies of everything, the executive meeting notes, the fabricated quotes, the confidentiality agreement, and most importantly, documentation of ongoing discrimination incidents I'd witnessed since my promotion. Miguel's expression grew darker as he reviewed each document, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions or request additional details. "This is explosive," he said finally, closing the folder. "They're essentially using you as a human shield while continuing the same discriminatory practices that triggered the investigation. Are you prepared for the consequences of going public with this?" I thought about Mrs. Elena's tears, about all the families who'd suffered in silence, about the colleagues who saw me as nothing more than a token hire. I can't live with being part of their lie anymore. The article published 3 days later sent shockwaves through Chicago's healthcare community. Hospital's diversity director exposes cynical manipulation behind discrimination investigation response, ran as the front page headline, with my photo prominently displayed. Miguel had done meticulous work, corroborating my claims with interviews from other hospital employees and the families who'd filed complaints. The story revealed not just Chicago General's manipulation tactics, but a broader pattern of superficial diversity initiatives designed to deflect rather than address systemic problems. Mr. Morrison called me into his office that afternoon, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled fury. "You violated your confidentiality agreement and committed corporate sabotage," he said, sliding a termination letter across his desk. "Security will escort you out immediately. We're also pursuing legal action to recover damages and ensure you never work in healthcare administration again." His threat might have terrified me a week earlier, but now I felt only relief. "Actually," I said, standing to leave, "my attorney says the confidentiality agreement is unenforceable because it was designed to cover up illegal discrimination. And the state investigators are very interested in your retaliation against a whistleblower." The color drained from his face. "You think you've won something here? You've destroyed your career for nothing. This hospital will continue operating exactly as it always has, just with better PR." But Mr. Morrison was wrong. The state investigation, armed with my insider documentation, found systematic violations of federal anti-discrimination laws. Chicago General was placed under federal oversight, required to implement court-supervised diversity programs, and faced millions in penalties. More importantly, the publicity sparked similar investigations at hospitals throughout Illinois, creating a domino effect that forced real policy changes across the healthcare system. Mrs. Elena called me the day after my termination was announced. "Mija, you sacrificed everything for us," she said through tears. "How can we ever repay you?" I told her the truth, that she'd already repaid me by showing me what real courage looked like. Her decision to file that complaint, knowing she might face retaliation, had inspired my own decision to speak out despite the personal cost. The legal battles took 18 months to resolve. Chicago General eventually settled the discrimination lawsuits for substantial sums and agreed to comprehensive policy reforms. My wrongful termination case resulted in a settlement that allowed me to finish my nursing degree without financial stress. More satisfying than the money, though, was the flood of job offers from hospitals genuinely committed to cultural competency, organizations that wanted someone with both lived experience and proven integrity. I accepted a position at Northwestern Memorial Hospital as their patient advocacy coordinator, a role similar to what Chicago General had offered me, but without the manipulation and political theater. My first initiative was establishing a program pairing bilingual volunteers with non-English-speaking patients, ensuring that no family would ever again face the isolation and fear that Mrs. Elena had experienced. 6 months later, I received a letter that made everything worthwhile. It was from Carlos Mendoza, Mrs. Elena's grandson, written in careful English with Spanish phrases mixed throughout. He was graduating from community college with a degree in healthcare administration, inspired by his grandmother's experience and my example to pursue a career advocating for Hispanic patients. "You showed us that one person can make a difference," he wrote. "But more importantly, you prove that doing the right thing is always worth the cost." Looking back, I realized that Tuesday morning when I helped Mrs. Elena wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the moment I chose what kind of person I wanted to be. The promotion that followed was built on deception, but my response to discovering that deception defined my character. Sometimes the right choice isn't the easy choice, and sometimes standing up for your principles means giving up everything you thought you wanted. The discrimination at Chicago General continues to improve under federal oversight, but change is slow and ongoing. Real progress requires constant vigilance, not just diversity theater designed to deflect criticism. My experience taught me that tokenism isn't just insulting, it's dangerous because it allows systemic problems to persist while providing the illusion of progress. Today, when I help Spanish-speaking families navigate the healthcare system, I think about Mrs. Elena's words. One kind person shouldn't be enough to make the difference between life and death. She's right. Compassion shouldn't be exceptional, it should be standard. And sometimes, creating that standard requires sacrificing the comfortable lie for the difficult truth. What do you think about this situation? Would you have made the same choice, or would you have stayed silent to protect your career? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on when speaking truth to power is worth the personal cost. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard.